In this video, I want to show you the different paint consistencies that I use in my paintings. I'll use some of my paintings as examples. And towards the end of the video, I'll go through a few problems that may occur when you work on wet paper. When I paint, I use a variety of paint consistencies in each painting. If I was to use the same consistency of paint right through my painting, it would look insipid and it would lack depth. Paint and water consistency is something that a lot of beginner painters have trouble understanding. So that's what I want to focus on in this video. To keep it as simple as I can, I've broken the paint consistencies that I use into 3 different levels. There's what I call watery paint mixtures, where the pigment is quite pale and thin, and I mainly use that at the start of a painting. Then there's a medium consistency that has got more pigment, less water. And then there's a third consistency that I use where there's a lot of pigment and hardly any water. These consistencies will vary slightly with each painting, but generally these are the 3 that I use. I'll start with the first consistency. The first consistency is fairly light in tone. I use a fair amount of water, and the puddle of paint after I've mixed it will move around on the palette if I tilt it. I'll hold the palette up and you can see that it's quite fluid. I used watery paint at that consistency right at the start of this rosebud painting. So let me show you how I used that consistency of paint on these paintings. This is permanent rose. I'm going to mix some water with it. This is the colour that I used on the rosebud. I've got my number 4 round brush and I pick up the paint with it. I've painted water over my rosebud. I've absorbed the excess puddles with my brush. And now I've got that paint mixture. And I'll paint that onto the wet paper, all over the rose. It's fairly pale. When this colour dries, it will be even paler than it is there. This is the initial wash that I paint on the rose. This colour will become the lightest areas on the rose, and I'll gradually build up each petal with darker pigment. Here on the old truck that I painted, I washed in the entire truck, panel by panel, with watery mixtures of paint. I'm wetting the back wheel hub with water here. I mixed burnt sienna and Windsor violet, and I thinned the paint with some water. And then I painted that onto the wet section. I also used some burnt sienna that was thinned with water. It didn't have any of the violet mixed with it. I painted the entire truck with watery paint mixtures until it looked like this. For those 2 examples, I painted the watery paint mixture onto wet paper. For this little crab painting, I painted the first watery mixture on the legs on dry paper. Okay, let's have a look at this. I'm getting some transparent yellow. I'm going to mix a tiny bit of Windsor violet with it. This is the Windsor violet. Don't need much. I mix them together, and then before I put this on my painting, I need to put some water in that mixture. This is some water now. Test the colour on a piece of scrap paper. That's a bit dark for what I want it for at the moment, so I know that when I start to paint that on my crab legs, I need to mix more water with it. So that's what I do, more water first. And that's what I used on the legs. This time I'm working on dry paper. I didn't need to wet them here. I'll talk a bit more about why I choose to paint on wet paper and dry paper in a moment. So you can see that's quite pale. I painted that watery paint all over the back legs of the crab. I've been asked before, how do I determine whether to paint on wet paper or dry paper? And that depends on a few things. I prefer to paint objects or shapes that are large or unusually shaped on wet paper because it gives me more time to get the paint on the paper. When the paper's wet, I don't have to worry about the paint drying in areas before I've finished. You know, when it leaves those hard paint lines where you don't want them. And sometimes it's really hot here and the paint will dry really quickly on the paper, which is another reason why I often wet it. Other times I might want to use more than one colour and the wet paper will give me more time to do that. Sometimes I may want the subject or the shape that I'm painting to have soft or lost paint edges around the outside of it. And again, the water on the paper allows me to do that. Smaller objects or shapes like the legs on the little crab that you saw me paint are quick to paint. So I'll usually paint smaller shapes on dry paper. The little rosebud that you saw me paint on wet paper, that could have been painted on dry paper, but I chose to paint it on the wet paper because I was able to paint on more of a patchy wash on the wet paper. You can see subtle differences in the paint. You'll notice that some areas are slightly lighter than others, and that helps to replicate the subtle differences of the petals on the rose itself. With the next consistency of paint, I add some more pigment, so the tone will be darker, but the paint is still fluid. It moves on the palette like the watery mixture that I just showed you, but probably not quite as fast as the watery mixture. When I put it on the wet paper, it will bleed or creep across the wet area. And I use this consistency of paint when I start to add detail and depth to my paintings. So this time I get more pigment and I'll use less water. So the tone of the colour will be darker in value than the watery mixture that I used at the start. There I've just put some water in. Now this is still fluid. It's still going to move on the palette if I tilt the palette up. Still going to run, but it's not as watery as that first mixture of paint. When I was painting this little rosebud, I allowed the first pale wash to dry and then I started to add detail to each petal. That's when I used the medium consistency of paint. This is my palette when I was painting the rose. That first mixture there was my initial wash. It's fairly runny, it's got a fair amount of water in it. And that's too watery for my next layer. So I mix a new puddle of paint away from that first puddle. I'm still using the same colour, but this time I'll use less water. It needs to have some water mixed into it though, or it won't move on my paper. I want soft paint edges on this petal, so I've wet that middle section with some water. And then I pick up the permanent rose from the second mixture and then I paint that onto the wet paper. I run it down the side where I see that the colour is darkest on the reference photo and the paint bleeds or moves over the paper. It's not spreading out of control. I've still got control of where it's going. Here I'm going to pull it down a bit further. And you can see I've left the lighter first initial wash showing in the lightest section of that petal. Going back to my truck painting now, once I had a light wash of colour all over it, I needed to increase the colour in the darker areas. The watery paint that I used for the first wash wouldn't be strong enough for that. I needed more pigment in my paint mixture and less water this time. So here I'm mixing the same two colours together, but I've got a lot more pigment. Into that, I'll mix a small amount of water. And then I paint that on the areas of the truck that are darker. So here I'm painting on wet paper as well. I won't completely cover this panel of the truck with this darker tone. On the lightest area of the panel, I'll leave that first wash of paint showing. Both of those examples were painted on wet paper again. I also used this middle consistency of paint on dry paper. This cast shadow here on my rosebud stem was painted with the middle or medium consistency paint on dry paper. When I started to paint in the leaves and the stem, I needed a dark green, so I mixed some yellow with the French ultramarine. I made a dark green and then I mixed some water into that. So that's a fairly dark colour. It's mainly pigment, but then I mixed some water into it. And I paint that onto the stem where I see a cast shadow. This time I'm painting on dry paper. I don't need any soft paint edges. The edge of this shadow is hard. It's a hard line. So I don't need to wet the paper there. And that's giving me that cast shadow in that dark colour. And that little leaf there is on dry paper as well. I used the third consistency of paint to add my darkest tones, usually towards the end of a painting. This pigment has got a small amount of water in it, but it doesn't really move on the palette. It's thick and it sticks to the paper. The water that's in it is mainly from the brush. I usually don't add any more water to it from my water container. I'll clean off my palette first so that I can show you. When I use paint at this consistency, the only real moisture that's in the mixture is the moisture that was on my brush when I picked the paint up. So I picked the paint up with a wet brush, but that's it. I don't add any more water from my water container. And then when I lift the palette, it doesn't move. The mixture stays where I've put it. And it does the same thing on the paper. Wherever I put it on the paper, that's where it sits. I want to darken the crab's eyes now. So here I'm wetting the paper with some water. So far I've got 2 layers on the eye. I've got the first initial watery layer of yellow. I let that dry and then I put on another watery layer of black. Here, what I do is wipe my wet brush over the dried pigment on my palette. So I'm not going to get any darker than that. And here the paint sticks to the paper like glue. I push it where I want it. The wetness of the paper allows me to take my time. It allows me to put the paint on there more easily. And I can also get some soft edges with that water that's on there. Just putting a bit more water there, it's a bit dry. So that's as dark as I'm going to get those eyes because that's virtually pure pigment. I'm wiping my brush over it on the palette. The paint has dried on the palette, it's no longer wet and sticky. So all I've done is wipe my wet brush over the top to reactivate it. I'll do the same thing now with some sepia. I've got sepia squirted out on my palette. So what I'll do is use my slightly wet brush to pick up that paint that's there on the palette. And then I use that on the dry paper this time. So I'm darkening all the little crevices. I try to always leave this sort of work until the end of the painting because I don't want to disturb that dark colour by layering more washes over the top. If I layer some water over the top of that, it's likely to lift off and create a mess everywhere. So I always try to keep my darkest darks until the end of the painting. Getting your paint and water consistency right is difficult when you first start painting in watercolour, but after a while it becomes intuitive and you no longer have to think too much about it as you're painting. You begin to know that as soon as you pick the paint up on your brush, you'll know that the mixture is going to be either too thick or too runny. So without even thinking about it, you'll either dip your brush in your water to make it weaker, or you'll dab your brush on your cloth to remove the excess water that might be in it. So give yourself some time to understand it. Now I want to show you a couple of things that might go wrong when you're working on wet paper, and I'll show you how to fix them if they do. One thing that can go wrong when you're working on wet paper is that you can put too much water on the paper. Pick some paint up. And then I paint it onto the wet paper, and what happens is the paint floats on top of the puddle of water that you've got there. Instead of absorbing down into the paper, it's sitting in the puddle. And if I was to tilt the board, you can see it just flows everywhere and I've got no control of where it's going. So that's one thing to watch, the amount of water that you put on the paper. Instead of doing that, this time I'll put the water on the paper, but I'll use my brush like it's a sponge to sop up the excess. Okay, so there's my water. Now I'll dab my brush on my towel and I'll use it like a sponge to take some of that water back off the paper. My brush is drier than the water that's on the paper, so it's acting like a sponge. And this is what it looks like. It reminds me of when I first cut open a juicy orange, and that's what the surface looks like. If I compare that to this puddle, you can see that great big puddle in the right-hand corner. So that's way too much water. I could have a splash around in that. So that's what my paper usually looks like when I'm working wet on wet. I'll pick up my paint again. And I'll paint that on there. And this time I've got more control of where the paint's going. It's moving or bleeding over the paper, and I can use my brush to push it where I want it. And it gives me those lovely soft paint edges. I can also tilt my board when the paper's like this and make the paint drift a bit more. And here's another issue or problem that some beginners have told me that they have when they work wet on wet. They start to wet their paper and they take off the excess. So they make sure there's no puddles of water lying anywhere. So their paper is ready to accept the paint. They pick up the paint then, but their puddle of paint might be too thick. It may not have enough water mixed into it. So when they touch their paintbrush to the paper, the paint doesn't move as much as they'd like it to. And that might be okay. That could be what they're wanting it to do. But if they're wanting it to move more over the paper like it did on my rose painting, like here, you can see the paint moving more, then they might need to mix a small amount of water into their paint mixture to make it a bit more fluid. So let's have a look. Just mixed a small amount of water into my paint mixture. You can see it's moving more now. And if I was to tilt my board again, it will creep down the paper. Sometimes the paint consistency might be perfect and the water on the paper might be perfect, but when you put the paint on the paper, it spreads out of control. And that could be because you've got too much water in your brush and it spreads too far. Then all you have to do is dab your brush gently on a towel to release a small amount of water and then pick the paint up again. So if you're having difficulty when you work on wet paper, be aware of how much water that you've got on your paper, how much water you've got in your paint mixture, and how much water that you have in your brush. And adjust one or all of those things and see if that helps. Another issue that people have contacted me about is when they mix 2 or 3 colours together, their paint will separate on the paper. That's not a bad issue, that's a good thing. Embrace it when it happens, because you can have some beautiful effects appear on your painting that you didn't even mean to do. Here's an example. Someone asked me how I got those different colours on the wings on this galah. I didn't do it deliberately. The paint separated after I'd mixed it and applied it to the paper. For my galah wings, I mixed some quinacridone red with cobalt turquoise light to make a grey colour. This is the cobalt turquoise light now. So I mixed the two together fairly evenly to create the grey that I was looking for the wings. I need a bit more of the turquoise. That's more like it. So that's pretty much pure pigment. To that, I will mix some water into it. So now I'll add some more water. So this will be the first wash that I put on the wings. So it's going to be fairly pale. So then I wet the paper again. It's a large area, so I'm wetting it with water. The water will help me to get the paint on there more easily, and I won't be concerned about hard paint lines forming where I don't want them. When it's all covered with water, I start to put the paint on. And you'll see as I put the paint on, it will start to spread and it will start to separate. And that's not something I did deliberately, it happened by itself. You can see some of the turquoise light showing there, and you can see the pink drifting out of the mixture, or the quinacridone red. And I deliberately used the quinacridone red because that's the colour I used on the pink of the feathers. So you can see that that's doing it all by itself. As I keep going with it, I get lighter down the bottom, and I've just got mainly water, tinted water there. So you can see the turquoise colour and the pink separating. And I think that that is one of the beautiful qualities of watercolour. My last tip, as always, is to practice. Like learning anything new, you've got to put the hours in. The more you paint, the more mistakes you'll make and the faster you'll learn. I can't tell you how many failed paintings that I've had over the years. It's no big deal. I learn from all of them and they make me a better painter. I don't throw them away. I use the back of them as scrap paper to try new things out. The full-length tutorial of this new rosebud painting will be posted on my Patreon site in April. The tutorials of these other paintings that I showed you in this video are already on there, along with over 100 other watercolour tutorials that I've made. So please join us there if you want to learn more about painting in watercolour. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful to you. A like on this video is always appreciated, and please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you in my next video. In this video, I want to share you with my family. I want to show you in this video. I want to show you. I don't want to share you. I prefer to paint objects or shapes that are large or unusually shaped on wet paper. I use this consistency of paint when I start to add detail and depths to my paint depths. Detail and depths. It's different depths. And you no longer have to think too much about it as you're painting. You'll begin to know as soon as you pick up the paint as examples. And towards the end of the video, I'll give you a drink of water. I used watery paint at that consistency. Sometimes it's really hot here and the paint dries very quickly on the paper. Still fluid. It moves on the palette like the watery mixture that I just showed you. Just before showed you. Difficulty when you work on wet paper, be aware of how much water you have on your paper. Be aware of gathering your thoughts before you speak.